Dude, we are going to energise the country.
We need to wake up and smell the coffee.
The independence case is a powerful one.
Another future's possible, but we've got to fight for it.
Order!
Hello and welcome to the Debated podcast. As always, I'm your host, Will. And in this episode of the podcast, I'm delighted to be joined by Thom Brooks, Professor of Law and Government at Durham University Law School, a member of the Fabians Society's Executive Committee and of the Society of Labour Lawyers, Director of the Labour Academic Network, author of several books, including Becoming British and Reforming the UK Citizenship Test, and the author of a new pamphlet recently published by the Fabian Society, which we'll be discussing today, New Arrivals, a Fair Immigration Plan for Labour. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Will. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you back because, of course, we previously had you on the podcasts quite a bit ago discussing similar subjects to this. But my first question to you is this. What made you decide to write this particular pamphlet on a new policy for Labour in terms of immigration?
Great. Well, thank you very much, and a terrific opening question. What drove me were a few things. I've had the great privilege of advising the front bench on immigration issues since 2014, starting with giving support to the manifesto's commitments around immigration for 2015, 2017, and 2019, but also branching out into advising on all matters of legislation, various points for debate, parliamentary questions, and so on and so forth. And one of the things that I've believed, as you can probably hear from my accent, I'm an immigrant myself, is I felt very strongly that Labour should have something powerful and compelling to say about immigration. It shouldn't be something that we're afraid to talk about. And I've been giving advice for a long time on ways in which we could do that. I was originally tasked by the previous Shadow Home Secretary, Nick Thomas-Simons, with thinking about, so what would a Labour, if Labour were in government, what would we do differently about the points-based system? It was a question to me. It wasn't a question for him. And I promised I'd get back to him. I'd give it some thought and I'd put something together. Well, this pamphlet is my completing that project for him, setting out what Labour's plan for immigration would be, what the system would look like, how it would be different from what the Conservatives have been doing, from everything from entry to exit and everything in between. So that was my kind of formal reason for putting it together. I also note that there's been, the Fabian pamphlet series is a very distinguished one, and I'm very honored to be amongst its authors, but there hasn't really been much of anything on immigration, seemingly ever in terms of the single authored pamphlets. There's been a few edited booklets over the years, but there hasn't been anything quite like this, and certainly not for a long time. So I thought something like this was necessary to kind of begin a conversation, if nothing else, but also to put into one place my considered kind of eagle-eyed view of the whole thing and how it should fit together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Now, the pamphlet is broken down into three parts: prosperity, respect, and security. In terms of coming up with these particular overarching themes, what was it that made you think of these specific words, prosperity, respect, and security?
Well, a number of things. As I noted, I've been advising the front bench since 2014, and in 2015, I had the great pleasure of working with the then Shadow Immigration Minister, a guy called Keir Starmer. And so we were working together on various policy ideas at that time, and looking to see how he would make the system differently. I was just giving some background advice and writing some odd papers about it. And one of the things that drove me from those days was centering it on fairness. So in the title, a fair system, a fair immigration system is what drives the project at its core, driven by, and I'm sure we'll get to lots of examples of this, in the system has not been fair either in how the Home Office operates or the policies that it is asked to implement, seemingly across the range. So I wanted to make it fair. Why those three words? Well, obviously this has become a kind of a mantra in the party at the moment. You might have noticed that I've changed the order slightly. So the normal line of security, prosperity, and respect, and I put security. I just mentioned it third. That's not a sign that security is not important or the most important area, and so on and so forth. Why I put that in the order in which I did was because when we think about immigration, one of the things that many people kind of confuse around that is thinking that most immigrants are asylum seekers, or there's some security issues and all the rest of it. And security is hugely important, and I have got a range of measures about that, and I'm happy to talk about that too. But I wanted to leave that at the end, because I think that one of the kind of the low-hanging fruit, as they say in the trade, is in making a more prosperous country out of the immigration system. I think it can be done in a controlled and measured way, where we can improve on what the Conservatives have done. So that's why I listed prosperity first. I think it's important that an immigration system that is fair to everyone. This is not about making the country worse off; it's making the country better off. I would kind of rhetorically say, why will we not want to be more prosperous, have greater respect amongst ourselves and those we welcome as our neighbors? And of course, we should give priority to security concerns, which I think can be strengthened in various ways. So it isn't just taking the mantra and just kind of, playing around with it, as easy as that might have been. It is, I think they are kind of core values to rally around, which is why I've divided my pamphlet into three parts with chapters addressing each of them. I do believe in these things, but I did want to kind of give a kind of a lexical priority in terms of which we talk about first in the pamphlet on prosperity, and kind of really tackle head on the idea that labor is a party of business. The clue is in the name labor. We want people to work and be successful, and but according to values. According to our values, and that's what I try to set out, and that's why I did it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd just like to tackle one of the proposals, which is in the first section, prosperity, which particularly stood out to me because I thought it was a particularly interesting one, which is the proposal for regional visas, that is, visas for workers that are linked to specific regions. And you give the example, for example, devolved governments or regions like the Northeast. Now, why do you think it would be a particularly good idea to have regional visas that are regionally linked? How do you think it could boost particular local economies by having that proposal in place?
Great, thank you. And an excellent point. I am happy to admit that I was originally very skeptical about the use of regional visas when it was first being talked about by various people. I remember Chuka Amuna, when he was a Labour MP, trying to kind of bring me on board with this idea, and I had a number of reservations, primarily around enforceability. But I've come around. for two, without speaking further with Chuka, unfortunately, it's nothing, not his fault. It's my fault, I guess. But for separate reasons. One of the reasons is that there are workable models for making something like this happen, and I've become convinced that a place like Canada, Switzerland has one too, but I've been more impressed by Canada's system, where they have a number of visas that are available to anyone to work anywhere in the country. But then they've got, they divide other visas by province. And what that allows provinces to do is to take ownership, to take responsibility for, are there any shortage occupation areas of interest to development of those provinces according to those provinces, not the central government top down or all the rest of it, allowing them to, kind of do things for themselves and allowing provinces, if they wanted to trade, to effectively barter. So effectively some provinces might sell off some of their share, as it were, to other provinces as and when, if because there might be different needs one year to the next province, to province. These are ways in which you have control over the total number of people. If the government wanted to have control, it can do that. You put the national interest first. Most are for anywhere, any job, any province. At the same time, kind of focusing some support on areas, more remote areas that might otherwise be missed or underdeveloped. And so one of the facts of immigration to the UK amongst those who work is that there is a disproportionate number that take up work in London South East. There's far more that go towards that area than, say, other parts of the UK. And that, of course, is partly because there are more opportunities, there are more jobs, there's more people in that part of the country. That's true. Another thing that I expect will be behind that also is you have higher wages in those areas, and not necessarily, and the importance of that is that the minimum income thresholds that the government has have been one size fits all. Well, it's easier to meet a national guideline in a part of the country that has higher relative wages, even if not, cheaper rents and mortgages and so on and so forth, than in other parts of the country where you might have a terrific quality of living, but the average salaries might be lower. And so one way of looking to kind of address this kind of one size fits all Westminster top-down model would be to allow some regional variation in the awarding of visas, including some controlled, as you noted, by devolved governments. I think it is possible to police this, say that you can only work for an employer at an address in a certain part of the country, though being open-minded about where one lives. And I think what is helpful about this is that the economic facts of immigrants who with work visas is that they tend to stimulate economies. They tend to be job creators. So in the government's efforts to level up, one issue here is that it would be easier perhaps to level up and attract new talents and skills to areas outside of London and in the Southeast, if it were easier to bring in highly skilled migrants to different areas that had to work in those areas in order to satisfy their visa. I'm surprised it's an idea that hasn't had more legs in recent years. It has been talked about for a while. As I said, I've had chats in the parliamentary tea rooms about this, as it were, for some years. And again, I know I've been skeptical myself about how this works, but I think it can work. We also have a bit of a model for this in terms of seasonal worker visas, where this will be linked to people very temporarily coming over, for work, say in the agricultural sector, that is, tied to a location for work, and that seems to have been a success. The biggest problem with the seasonal worker visas, that there's a far greater demand for seasonal workers than the government seems able to facilitate. Even though the government has been offering a number of visas, it's not been able to come close to meeting its own targets. And I note, as I say in my pamphlet, that over 80% of the seasonal worker visas were awarded the last 2 years to Ukrainian citizens, and there's kind of new concerns around that given recent events. But that's why I'm for the regional visa now, and some thoughts around how it might work.
Absolutely. I'd like to now turn just to a point that you make in the respect section, which I thought was particularly interesting, which was ensuring equal recognition of native British languages like Welsh, Scotch Gaelic, and Cornish. Now, how do you think that would work? And also, do you think that would help to perhaps restore some balance that people feel in particular parts of the UK in terms of the union, and might improve a feeling of unity towards the United Kingdom?
I am especially pleased you've touched on this, Will. So thank you for the opportunity to say something about this. This is important. I mean, I have a number of ideas. This is in a chapter on English language, and some of my ideas are around closing loopholes the government has in being able for immigrants being able to, in certain circumstances, get around having to prove they know satisfactory English, and also ending a postcode lottery of English language support. But on these languages, as I refer to them as British languages in the pamphlet, the idea is something like this. When we hear people today talk about the importance of being British, and we hear things like the importance of knowing English, people are, of course, right to say knowing English is hugely important, and I'm all for it. In fact, I'm for closing loopholes on it and increasing provision. So you might say I'm much tougher on English language requirements than the government and perhaps many others as well. So I'm not so fully committed to that. However, there's a revisionist view that says that to be British, it has always meant that you needed to be fluent in English. And that has most definitely not been true. At the founding of the UK, in the Act of Union between England and Scotland, unfortunately for the Welsh, already part of England by that time, as it were, it was not a matter of common law that you needed to be fluent or know a word of English per se. That Welsh and Scots Gaelic have always had equality with English for most of British history. And in fact, until October 2013, it was possible to become a citizen without having to show you knew any English or prove you had fluency in English. This is because until Halloween in 2013, under the coalition government, they stopped the ability of people to do things like pass the citizenship test, which is offered in English, Welsh, and Scots Gaelic, and allow it to count not only for your having knowledge of life in the UK, which it still does, which is a requirement for permanent residency and citizenship, but they allowed it to satisfy the language requirement as well. And when that stopped in 2013, this has meant that you could pass the citizenship test in Welsh or Scots Gaelic, and it is offered, though it's almost never taken up for reasons I can get into. But you still had to do the English language test. Now, one thing I think is important is that when we travel to Wales, Scotland, some parts of Northern Ireland, you do hear different languages being spoke, different British languages being spoke. And in some areas, they are the mainstay of everyday life. And it has been historically and culturally true for centuries that these languages have been given a kind of equality with English. So when we go to Wales, we will see signs in English and Welsh and forms in English and Welsh and so on and so forth. And one of the ideas here is giving kind of greater recognition of the importance of these languages. I don't think that if someone were, and you might say it'd be highly unlikely, but if someone were able to show a proficiency in one of these languages, some say informally, they probably have a degree of fluency in English anyway, but if someone is a Welsh speaker and they live in Wales, then why shouldn't it be important for thinking about their integration? It might be in some areas the best thing they could maybe do to integrate to their areas and so on. Cornish, the reason I mentioned Cornish is I hope I get my dates right for the podcast. It would have been, it would have been during the time of the coalition government between 2010 2015. I think 2014-ish or 2015, Cornish was given protected minority status. Now, a great many people at the time, what comment there was on the different news channels, I won't name and shame any particular this morning. They often reflected on what in the world that means, and often thought it just was a kind of a broadly just a symbolic thing. Liberal Democrats, coalition partners, had a presence in Cornwall. It's thought as maybe trying to connect with their supporters in some way. And in terms of a formal importance, it allowed extra funding to go for Cornish language and cultural activities and so on and so forth. Now, there's two other things that I think are of possible interest. One of them is that protected minority status in law means that those groups that are identified in that way, the Welsh, Scots, Gaelic, the Irish, are to have an equality in how their cultures and so on are treated. And one of many ways this is manifest, this is not the only way, and I am not suggesting it's the only way or most important way and so on, but one of the ways this is manifest is in, one of my favorite topics, the citizenship test, where new immigrants, people who want to be permanent residents or citizens, are required to know about the patron saints of all parts of the UK, not just England, of course, but also to know the national foods, to know the flags, to know various things about Welsh culture, Scots culture, people at Northern Ireland, and so on and so forth. What is missing is any mention of the Cornish. And after the Cornish were granted protected minority status, there was then a legal obligation on the government to treat the Cornish with some degree of equality with the other protected minority groups. And one way in which the government tried to fulfill that was in extra funding for Cornish language and cultural activities. And that was good. But one thing that has not happened is that there's not been any revision yet of the citizenship test, amongst other things, which ought to happen in order to grant that equality. And the other thing is that the other, the Welsh and Scots Gaelic speakers, they are able to take the test in their languages. It ought to be available in Cornish if they are to have a protected status with the others. I've heard lots of people say they didn't think the Cornish status mattered a whole lot, but I've not heard anyone say that it should be taken away. And if it should stay, and I think it should, then that's one of many things that ought to happen. And we might think, well, hang on a second, this sounds a bit crazy. Cornish language, why should that all of a sudden, one might say, have some kind of equality with the Welsh language and Scots Gaelic? Is this some kind of weird coalition government hangover, or words to that effect? I'm not trying to put words in an imaginary critic's mouth, but there you are. And so this brings to my other very quick point, is that it's actually the case for the last couple centuries that in Parliament, if you wanted, when you take up a seat in Parliament, and well, perhaps you will one day, you have to swear an oath of allegiance. This can be done in English. It can be done in Welsh. It can be done in Scots Gaelic. You know where I'm going with this.
Yeah.
And it can be done, and as I understand it, has occasionally been done in Cornish, and there is an official Cornish version you can use. So to kind of say that the Cornish language should have some type of equality, and I am not Cornish myself. I've got no DNA connection that I'm aware of. I'm not in any family or other connection with Cornish. So this is not coming from me, as it were, from my own personal idiosyncrasies. It has been something in Britain that we have recognized multiple British languages together, that they've had a kind of equality in a way like that. They continue to do so, including the Cornish. And I think it's a problem that it's so half-hearted, that the government has not kind of fulfilled even the basic terms of giving the protected minority status to the Cornish, but also for the Welsh and Scots Gaelic speakers. If you're going to have, for example, allow a test for people to become citizens and vote with full rights alongside you and others, then there ought to be a handbook in that language to help you prepare for the test in that language. But they allow you to sit the test in Welsh, but you need to study for it in English. And I think things like this are one of the many ways the system is unfair and should be corrected.
Certainly.
There you are. Long story on British languages, but that's my full reason.
But a very fascinating one and an insight, as you say, into the differences that currently are in the system and things that should be changed and could quite easily be changed. I
was fascinated by it because at the time, people thought it was kind of an electioneering gimmick and wasn't really important. And I was asking, I was dean of a law school. I was asking my colleagues, so what the heck is protected minority status, and trying to get my head around all the implications of that. And I found it interesting stumbling on what this meant and how the government, why it should go further. And I called on them to do so. They are in no ignorance of my views on this, but if for various reasons have failed to take it further. Though they have said in a parliamentary question, I think in 2017, I'm trying to be fair. Will, I'm desperately trying to be fair to the government. In I think a shocking revelation in a parliamentary question I wrote for Afzal Khan, the then shadow immigration minister, who took over from Keir Starmer. The government said that they were looking into making the test available in Cornish. So I know this is officially on their plate. They are officially aware of the need to do something like this, unless they plan on pulling the status away from our brothers, sisters, and brethren in Cornwall, but and the greater Cornish community outside it, but the diaspora. But there you are. There you are. Fascinating stuff.
Absolutely. Well, I think for our listeners as well. And another point from the section on respect that I thought was quite interesting, I'd just like to touch on, is the introduction of a new bank holiday called UK Day that you propose. What do you sort of think would happen if we did have a UK Day introduced in Britain?
Yeah, so several ideas come into mind here. So I've had mostly criticism. I've been very pleased to see how well received thus far my pamphlet has been, granted in its early days. But one of the criticisms I've had from some Labour Party members more to the left than I am is a kind of a real aversion to this idea, which has surprised me a bit. And so let me explain why I was thinking. I mean, first of all, Jeremy Corbyn was arguing for a bank holiday, an extra bank holiday or so as well, if I recall correctly. So the idea of calling for new bank holidays or extra bank holidays is not for me a left or right issue, and it's not itself even a novel idea. There's been many others who've been arguing for this for some bank holiday as well. The issue has been, and this is driven, of course, by the fact that you have varying numbers of bank holidays in the UK, which one becomes more mindful of when you don't live in England or have strong connections outside. But so different parts of the UK have different numbers of bank holidays. England has the fewest, but as a group, as it were, as a country, we fall behind other countries in the number of bank holidays that we have, and by more than one. So an extra one, I didn't think itself, would if anything, would bring us a bit closer to other European countries and even the United States, and so on. The idea of the UK Day is kind of motivated. My thinking around it was motivated by two kinds of things. The first, in my mind, was that we've all been living through this horrible time with COVID, 2 years of lockdown, where it would seem, with the exception of the prime minister's partying antics, that the rest of us, were, by and large, abiding by the lockdown rules and separated from family and friends. And this is painful, both in our not being able to share what should be happy milestones of special birthdays and births and other types of stuff like that for people, but of course more vividly, loss of loved ones during this time. And I know a great many who lost a lot of, many members of the family, not least poor Afzal Khan had some terrible tragedies in his family from COVID. And so we've been apart from each other and we've missed each other. And so one thought was, in having a new bank holiday, it seemed that it would be good as a means of coming together and, as it were, kind of celebrating these bonds of community, solidarity, togetherness that we have, given that we've all been having to sacrifice this for this public health reasons for the last 2 years. And that made me reflect on my American backgrounds and where we have a holiday of Thanksgiving Day. Canada has Thanksgiving Day as well. Other countries do too. It's not only America, and they all happen at different times. America happens to be in November. That doesn't motivate me with this UK Day for November, but I note that more of a coincidence. But the idea of Thanksgiving has historical roots in early settlers giving thanks for being a community, breaking bread with the indigenous peoples, and so on and so forth. But what it's become symbolized today has been a day of family and friends and people coming together and giving thanks in a very secular way. And I thought that some type of Thanksgiving-like event, moment, a time for families and friends to come together in a new time of the year, make something kind of new and special about, make this a positive legacy of COVID, that, after what we've gone through, that there's a new bank holiday and a time, where we are all expected to come together and in remembrance of when we could not do that. I thought that would be a good thing. And then I was reflecting further on, how else I could give this a bit of substance beyond that. And there again, looking for various comparative examples, look to Australia, which introduced an Australian Day a few decades ago. And the Australian Day was one of kind of very much a community coming together, street celebration kind of thing, where also there would be several public, for those who wanted it, you do not have to do it, but public citizenship ceremonies, and a time to kind of remember, the values of being Australian and things like this. And so I was thinking about that it would be very useful and be very helpful, and I think very positive to bring these things together. And then thinking about when it should be, of course, we have Remembrance Sunday in November, where we look to the past and the sacrifices that people made in the past, and celebrate that looking backwards, as it were. I thought that we don't, of course, have a bank holiday on the Monday to look forward, and I thought that's I think that's how I see this as kind of the other half of a wider whole, as it were, to make a kind of a bank holiday weekend around that, where we look backwards and in kind of more solemnly on the Sunday, but then look forward on the Monday, and give kind of more chance for people to come together and so on, and to celebrate British citizenship. And for various reasons, I think that would be a very good thing, and for those, and perhaps especially for those in the Labour Party. After all, it was a Labour government that introduced the citizenship ceremony in the first place, and they shouldn't be happening as mine did, in a back room, upstairs, little natural light, in a closed space where the pizza that was available afterwards wasn't for me. Oh no, it was for the young school children, singing songs for us, welcoming us to Britain, with no further mention made of the event in any local press or anything like that. So I see it as a day that, new bank holidays are things that the left and right have both been arguing for. I don't take that as ideological. I think making more of the Remembrance Sunday weekend, I think, would be a good thing. I think that some kind of British, form of Thanksgiving after COVID is a good thing as well. That I think, if you ask people, would you like a bank holiday in November to spend time with friends and family after the 2 years we've all had, I bet you'll get a very positive response if you knock on doors and ask people on the street about this. And then to connect this with some, have some kind of further activities around citizenship, and make it to kind of connect it, kind of in that way with the Sunday, I think would make it kind of very, very special occasion. Of course, many bank holidays, some people just stay at home. Some people don't turn on the TV. Some people do other things. They pursue other activities, and that's wonderful, and they should absolutely do that. It's not saying everyone has to go out and wave the flag if they don't want to, or don't have one, or don't want to have one, so on and so forth. But I think that there is more that can be done in this space. And when people think about what we can do to help integration, what we can help community build, and all the rest of it, this is one of a great many ideas. I have over 60 proposals in this pamphlet. I don't want to say this is the only one, but there's a lot of things that we can do, and I think this is one of them that fits again what a kind of model for a new bank holiday others have said. But I like to think I connect it with a greater purpose and have a better rationale for its timing than some of the other proposals I've heard.
Absolutely,
that's my thinking.
Yes, no, absolutely, and you can see your thinking very clearly. I'd just like to turn now to the final part on security, and to pick up one of the proposals, which is to launch a hate crime offender register. I mean, how important do you think this would be in terms of making people who have recently arrived in the UK feel safe if they knew that such a thing as a hate crime offender register existed?
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for asking this question. I've really been enjoying this conversation. The hate crime offender register first came to mind to me when there were a spike of hate crimes that happened, after the EU referendum. And people were saying things like, how do we, what are the ways in which we could kind of clamp down on this kind of behavior? Of course, we know what are hate crimes. These things are set out and noted in court when people are convicted. So it's not a matter of trying to signpost what this is. And I'm talking about people, thinking about a hate crime offender register, offender being the critical word. I'm not talking about, philosophical issues of, what constitutes a hate crime and all the other stuff. I'm talking about people who have been convicted of doing a criminal offense that falls under a hate crime categorization. So I'm very specific on that. This is not a thought police kind of project by any stretch of the imagination. Okay, so one idea I had at that time, which I maintain, and I'll get to why I think the wider importance for immigrants and others, was what exactly could be done. I thought, well, since we know we people are convicted for hate crimes, this does happen, sadly too often, that I am not for generally increasing the punitiveness in terms of, adding time in prison and stuff like that for various reasons. I often think, that could be, it can kind of satisfy a kind of senses of public anger sometimes. But if we're interested in changing minds and rehabilitating offenders and other types of stuff, I often think there's other alternatives that work much better. But that's another conversation. But on hate crime offenders, what would be helpful would be if there were additional consequences for doing those types of offenses, not in terms of increasing sentencing, not in changing terms of parole or other types of things per se, or adding hours of community service, which happens in a great many cases. Things like that. It wasn't about kind of tweaking with that. But I thought, at the moment with sex offenders, when people are to register, part of the consequences of that is that it prevents individuals from working in certain occupations. You can't be working with children. You can't be working with vulnerable people in general. It rules out careers in police enforcement and stuff like this. And I thought that kind of consequence, and it's something that can be reviewed, right? So once you're on a register, doesn't mean you must be on it for life. It is possible to get this judicially reviewed, and I think that's important as well, because I believe in and are trying to rehabilitate offenders wherever we can, and where we can't to work harder in doing so. And I think that a hate crime offender register would give a greater symbolic kind of gravitas to the importance that society takes to tackling hate crime, taking it more seriously without adding cost in prisons and other types of things that some might propose, and which I also think are counterproductive. It gives greater symbolic importance. It shows there's something different. When you do a crime like this, you're on a register, your name is on a list, and that this will mean that certain occupations will be off the cards for that person. And I think that is also important as well, because after all, why would we want people convicted of hate crimes be teaching young children, be working with vulnerable people,
Absolutely.
and so on and so forth. People have concerns about discrimination more widely, and surely when someone does a hate crime offense, that has crossed a particular line. It's gone very far, and I think that would be a good way of making a positive, constructive action. Again, operating much like the sex offender register. I'm not saying hate crime offenders are just like sex. I'm absolutely not saying that whatsoever. But I'm saying that we have a model for a register that people are on that forbids one from doing different occupations, and I would broadly have them kind of those registers operate similarly. Of course, the way offenders for each are treated in the criminal justice system is very different, and should remain so. But I think that this would be a way of taking hate crime more seriously. And I think also, finally, that in terms of labor values and so on, people sometimes get very nervous about this idea of progressives or those on the political left, baring their teeth when it comes to criminal justice matters, and somehow plays to, I think, a trope that the right are for using prisons, and somehow the left is for hugging trees or hugging hoodies, as David Cameron himself was proposing. He was proposing to hug hoodies, not the left. But this idea of one side hugging hoodies, the other side locking everybody up, and that's of course not true. I'm publicly a good friend of Robert Buckland, the former Lord Chancellor. He's been very much for rehabilitation efforts and promotion of restorative justice and other things. Not all conservatives are that way, and that's a very important point. And likewise, I think on the left, I think that it's consistent with labor values that we take a strong stand against hate crimes, and if people were engaged in hate crimes of any kind, people would be calling on their removal from the party as a consequence. Very easily arguing that, and probably all kinds of horrible trolling online behind it. So I think that to have a register like this, to say that this will limit career options, at least for the short and medium term, subject to judicial review, I think is consistent with labor values. It takes it more seriously. It gives a greater symbolic importance to the need to tackle hate crimes, and sends a message, communicates a message that for those who think that hate crime isn't that bad or isn't that important, and it'll just add a few hours here, a few months onto that. Well, actually, there'll be wider consequences for you. And you ought to take it more seriously. That and I think in light of the lack of many other good ideas, other than just throwing education people, of course I'm all for that, but there hasn't been actually a lot of serious ideas on tackling hate crime beyond greater education and awareness and so on. And this might be a way of spurring that on in the more serious cases where people aren't, where people are engaged in hate crime related activities. So that's one of the many ways I propose tightening up some of the rules and regulations. And I think this has a wider importance. I'll just make two last points. One, I think it might reassure those who come from other countries who might have concerns about hate crimes happening to them for whatever their protected characteristic might be, that this country takes such matters very seriously, and they should feel safe here. We should all feel safe, and that we've gone this extra step. And Priti Patel likes talking about how Britain can be a world leader and all the rest of it, and blah blah, and a lot of it a bunch of hot air. But this might be a way where sensibly we could be a genuine leader on this, and I think it might be something to help tackle the rise of some really concerning extremist groups and activities and so on in this area. The final point I'd make is that one of the things that's been insistent by folks on the left and perhaps very vocally on the right is the need on the citizenship test. I know David Blunkett, very strong on this, former Home Secretary who was behind the creation of the citizenship test. It was his former university tutor, Sir Bernard Crick, who at Sheffield University, my alma mater, that actually put the first test together. They're very committed to the idea that on the test there are questions about the equality of women, the freedom of racial discrimination, and so on and so forth in the test, and that people who come here and sit it ought to be tested on these British values about toleration, about anti-discrimination, about equality, and that this is a kind of a very important message that, you know, maybe in other countries there's views on how genders interact in the workplace and the home, but here in Britain we have a particular view of equality and how this works, and it's important that this value is known and taken to heart. And I think and having a hate crime register might be another way of kind of furthering that project, again, in a line that is consistent with both sides of the political divide.
Absolutely. And I think, as you say, it's one that I think people across the spectrum could certainly agree with. Thank you for coming on the podcast, Tom. We're coming rapidly towards the end of the podcast, and I have one final question for you. We've recently just passed Easter. Easter has not that long ago ended, and of course, as part of Easter, we like to have things like Easter bunnies and Easter eggs. So my final question to you is this: if you could have an Easter egg fashioned out of any politician, alive or dead, which politician would you choose to have an Easter egg fashioned in the shape of or based on the appearance of?
Oh my! Well, if I had such an Easter egg, Will, I don't know if I'd want to eat it, and that's critical. I mean, I've been a long admirer of Clement Attlee, and my normal reply would be to say something like that. But I'll say, I'll come forward and say it. Keir Starmer. Keir's an old friend. I've got enormous admiration for him and respect. And I think, we need more things like this. He's the true prime minister in waiting. I've known this for a long time, long before he was in the shadow cabinet. And, it's in fact, Keir was the last person I shook hands with and had a beer before lockdown, when I was at his leadership HQ in Vauxhall in March 2020, which seems almost a lifetime ago now, but not really all that long ago. I have huge admiration for him, and he is someone that inspires me. And I would say of him, I think he is the feature of our party, and I'm going to be working doggedly and flat out. I'm happy to be quoted to ensure that he becomes our next prime minister at the soonest available moment.
Excellent. Well, I think that's
it'll be a fine, Easter egg at that.
Yes, I think it would be an excellent Easter egg. Thank you once again for coming on the podcast, Tom. If people want to find out more about you and find where they can get the pamphlet, where should they go to find out more about you and to get a copy of the pamphlet?
The easiest place would be either on Twitter, Thom, THOM _Brooks, without an E. I can't spell either name. Blame my being American. Or my website, which is thombrooks.info.
Excellent. Thank you once again for coming on the podcast, Tom.
A great joy.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast. If you've enjoyed it, you can subscribe to us on iTunes, Spotify, Podbeam, and Amazon Music. You can also follow us on Twitter, @DebatedPodcast, like us on Facebook, Debated Podcast, And if you'd like to get in touch with us, whether about appearing on an episode of the podcast or commenting on an episode that you've listened to, you can do so at thedebatedpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you for listening. I hope you listen to the next one.